Hello there, I'm Adam Forbes. I am the host of the Corporate Escapology podcast and the author of Corporate Escapology, the book. Today, my guest is Lilli Graf. She's a design consultant. She has worked in corporate innovation and for various agencies as a design consultant. She specialises in service design. She's also a passionate advocate of climate resilience and climate adaptation. So this is how a business is going to cope and deal with the effects of climate change. And what she identified was one of the best ways that an individual can become more climate resilient is to work for themselves, work independently, get choice over for whom they work, where they work, the kind of work that they want to do. And she identified that many people around in her network were feeling the same. So she's formed a community called IMMA Collective, which really focuses on impact. And this community of freelancers and solopreneurs are all sharing ideas, they're sharing jobs, they're supporting one another. And Lilli has formed this and is building this up. So let's meet Lilli now. Hey, Lilli, it's great to have you on the Corporate Escapology podcast today. Welcome.
Thank you for inviting me.
Great. Well, let's start by hearing a little bit about your early career. So you've started off in open innovation, so bringing together innovation, presumably startups with corporate. So tell us a bit about that and how did that kind of lead you down a particular path?
Yeah, so I started early in my career as an innovation project manager. And so it was mostly European funds and most projects that are funded by the European Union are really looking forward. So I was working on open innovation in 2009 or even circular economy and how you finance that. And a lot of the projects that we made needed to create digital platforms. And often you work 3 years on them and with relatively little success. And then you need to stop and then you need to find money again to put that into practice. And so you have those cycles in which you actually implement and kind of try to have an impact, and the cycles in which you just write proposals. And as one of those cycles of writing proposals just neared, I was like, this is not for me. And I wanted to, just work on things and make them happen. And so a bit randomly at that time, a recruiter approached me and asked me, do you want to come and work for Lidl and the supermarket? And I said, let me go to the interviews and see how that works and is. And so I ended up there.
With no retail background?
Really? No, it was mostly in managing projects in HR and working with the HR director. And I remember in that conversation of the interview, they asked me, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And I told her, I would like to work in an agency for service design because I discovered this new thing and I really wanted to achieve that. And so the HR director said, but why are you here then? And I said, I need to learn how big corporations work. And
yes.
And so, that has been my honesty actually still got me that job. And so, that has been kind of actually a short career because I realized after 10 months in and after the first 4 months of kind of really starting in the shop and the kind of regional warehouse, regional office, all the headquarters, was able to really observe how a big company is structured and works. But it also wasn't a place for me because there was very little creativity. Lidl is known for its operational excellence.
Yes.
And I was just at the wrong place at the wrong time. But I think that was actually the best thing ever because when you are a bit comfortable, it's fine. But when you actually get uncomfortable, you probably take more risky choices.
That's an interesting idea. Yes. And I guess Lidl plus the corporate innovation stuff you've been working on, you picked up quite a lot of some of the, I guess, pros and cons of corporate. The big one being scale, of course. A company like Lidl can offer somebody that's fairly new into a career, the big opportunities. But as you say, the pace and the creativity and the agility, all of those things that those kinds of companies struggle with. So then you went in. So by that time you started getting to service design, and maybe you could just give a bit of definition to that, because I'm not sure everyone kind of understands what service design is. It's like when I say everyone. keep me.
Sure. I think I often like to explain service design with an example. And so if you think a product designer who wants to design a bike might sit down and might make a few drawings of a bike. And then the next step would be about making a prototype of that bike. And the next step would actually be, as the prototype works, you then put it into production and then you sell it. When it comes to service designer actually designs a bike sharing service. And so when you design a bike sharing service, you actually need to not just think about the bikes, but you need to think probably about an app where people actually can create an account and check out and figure out where are those bikes. Then you probably need to figure out how do you maintain those bikes? How do you move them around? And so you can see how it's not just about the bike, but it's really an ecosystem of many touch points. And once you change one thing, actually it has a cascading effect on many others. And so actually, if you think, 60-70% of our GDPs are made out of services, and especially in big services like government, banking, health, all those require service designers so that they are designed intentionally and that they're designed with putting people at the center and not just from, this is the process, let's go with it. We all have experienced moments in which we interface with customer service said, this is not my responsibility, or no, you get crazy kind of going from one place to the next to figure out how you're going to do that.
Yeah, I mean, of course, that's massively improved over the last decade or so. You think about just the experience of losing your luggage at an airport. I mean, it's still pretty traumatic, but there are processes in place now. There's transparency into the process too. You can interact online to try and find and locate your luggage. So it was a building industry, I guess, but fairly new still when you decided to throw yourself into it. So what did you do next after Lidl?
Yeah, I think there was this moment in which I just sat down and I was kind of drawing this timeline, from here to 1 year in the future. And I drew different timelines. And one was like, just learn it at the site, try to implement it where you are. And I thought, okay, then I'm still in the same place next year. And then there was a master in service design on the weekend. And I thought I could do that at the site. But again, in the next year, it would be in the same place. And then there was this master in service design at the Politecnico in Milan. And I realized that was full-time and I wouldn't know where I was in the next year. And so I thought, let me try this out. And so at 29, I decided to just quit my job and go back to university and take 1 year off. And that was pretty hard because a lot of Italians were saying, why are you giving up your security and to put yourself to learn something that almost nobody had heard of, and starting from scratch and doing such a big career transition. And it definitely was hard because one, if you have been working for some time and going to zero in terms of income, that feels scary. And two, suddenly you were good at something and you start out from scratch. So it really impacts your level of confidence. And it also it took me a year then to build up a network and to make it happen. So apart from the master, I then ended up actually going to London, because when it comes to service design, London is probably the most advanced city in the world in this sector, because it started from public government. They had this famous government digital services team. And then many people from that government were going to Tesco, banks, and kind of implementing service design in all those big organizations. And service design is very necessary in big organizations because the decision makers are very far away from the customer and the people using your service. And so as a service designer, you usually represent the customer in the conversation and you advocate for their perspective and what they need.
That's really interesting. So even though I didn't really quite know what service design was, I was actually part of that. I was working in the Cabinet Office in the UK at that time when all of those that e-government stuff was going on, digital services. and I was responsible for having a baby, which was pretty ridiculous as a, I don't know, 20-something bloke. But my job was to sort of integrate, or at least create the perception of joined up services across all the different departments around the idea of the life journey of having a baby. So it's really interesting. I had no idea that London or the UK was, at the forefront of all of that. And of course, I did know a bunch of those people that did go off into the private sector and make a lot more money than they're making in government, certainly, from those kind of skills. So, really interesting. And so what kind of jobs did you do after that then? When you stayed in London for a bit and did some work here? What did you do next?
So basically, I realized my dream. I worked in service design agencies and consultancies. And so that was moving into this consulting role. And I back then already had this dream of working for myself. So I really took those, in the end, it was 5 years in London. And I worked for 3 different agencies to really kind of fill my luggage with all the tools and insights that I could get. I worked a lot in, public sector, like public health, and also finance. And actually, money and health are very close. They're all about prevention, or kind of helping people to think long term and doing things that they might not want to do now, but actually need. And then I think at a certain point, specifically, I wanted to prototype freelancing. So what I did is I negotiated a 4-day week. So I was relatively risk adverse. I didn't know, do I truly want this? Actually, do I have what it takes to work for myself? Or is this just an idea? And so I think I just, instead of kind of taking the full leap, I just was able to say, okay, I'm working 1 day less a week. And then 1 day I can start building up my network, maybe testing things out. And for me, the easiest way to testing out was to essentially providing workshops and trainings on service design in Italy, so that it wouldn't be kind of a conflict of interest with my company. That was also kind of sincere.
Okay, so, I mean, there's so much there. That's really interesting. I mean, just that phrase, prototyping freelancing, I think is a really interesting way to look at the problem that you may have of being in a job that isn't quite right, but you're not necessarily sure that you want to just make a complete leap at that time. And, and you were still relatively young, but, people in their, 40s, 50s with big mortgages and family responsibilities certainly aren't in that position, most of them, to just literally flip and just, I'm going to try this. So this phrase prototyping is really interesting, because obviously it comes from this idea of what you might do with technology or with businesses, and startups using that kind of model all the time to try things without going too far down the path of no return, or taking too big a risk of capital or time, and just trying things small like that. So although it probably still felt quite big to you, because a day's lost salary, and also, of course, there's a sort of, maybe you're sending a signal to your employer as well around your medium-term intent. So there is some risk about that. How did you feel at the time? Was it liberating, or did you feel some anxiety and uncertainty around that?
I think maybe it was easier because when I had the first interview, I said I would be only available for 4 days a week.
Okay.
And I also could make the case for them of how this would benefit because especially as I was doing teaching and training, when you teach something, you actually get much better at what you do, because you actually are able, and you need to become good at explaining complex things in simple ways. And so I just made a bit of probably a business case of why this is actually beneficial for them, because you get more value from me, even if I work less. And then sometimes what potentially was really hard for me was being able to deal with maybe the guilt and the kind of element that when you're not working and when you're not available, especially if you work in a fast-paced consultancy, and you're not around. And I think one of the very concrete things that helped me was that I would take the Friday off that week and then the Monday of the week after. So I would have 2 long weekends of 4 days. And maybe Friday I was still a bit in this mood, maybe I check my email or something. And by Monday I didn't care at all. And so that was a bit a way for me to actually and have a considerable amount of time to work on my project and to see where that goes.
So there was another guest that we had that did something a bit similar to you. She's actually building a kind of platform to help people better understand what consulting is all about as a career. So junior consultants, helping them to get prepared. And she's doing consulting on the side. Well, actually, that's her main job, and the other one is her on the side probably. And it's an interesting idea where you can find, just like you've done, these sort of points where the employer isn't threatened by what you're doing there, and it's not even not threatened. They're actually seeing it as additive. They're seeing it as creating incremental value. You become like effectively an expert that they can potentially, in your case, charge out more for, because you're like become like an expert over a year or two, become known for that. Plus, potentially, you're out there maybe even doing business development unconsciously or consciously for them, because you're talking to clients potentially in a different market from the one they're in too. So there's lots of benefits, as you say, and making that business case there that you made is really, makes it very commercial. It's not oh, please do me a favor. Actually, there's value for you here, and I'm exposing it. If you can't see it, or you tell me you can't see it, I'm exposing it that I know that too.
Yes. And also, one of the things that is key to freelancing or working to yourself is building a strong network and strong relationships. Because if you think 84% of work comes from word of mouth. So if you start doing that before you leave that job, it's like planting lots of seeds. But like seeds, they don't kind of grow immediately. They take time and they take like energy to nurture. And so if you start doing that much earlier, you actually build yourself up kind of a healthy network that you can rely on once you take the decision, if it's the right thing. And otherwise, if you decide you're not doing it or taking this decision, you actually are, you don't lose anything.
I mean, sounds very logical, and it de-risks the whole thing. And and that's really what I'm advocating with Corporate Escapology, this preparing, and a lot of the preparation that's needed. Don't do these things just like in reaction. And a lot of people, can get so fed up at work that they do just react because they hate it. But actually, it's a really, it's not very sensible and can be a bit reckless anyway to do that. Far better to prepare. And network is one of the gaps that often corporate people really struggle with, because their network to get anything done is obviously all internal or just on the periphery of the corporate. And finding yourself outside trying to find work from nothing is really, really tough. So network is one of the first things, that external network is one of the first things people need to start building. Particularly like the idea that you set yourself up doing something quite different from the corporate. I mean, but both so that there was less of a threat there, but also it created a bit of a boundary around what you were doing, so there weren't bleeding these two things and risking time being unclear, and also identity being a bit unclear too. So you could really set yourself up with almost a new identity related to what you've been doing. But how did that work in practice?
So essentially, I started out, initially there was a project for in Italy, so doing some mostly trainings, and I focused on social impact companies and organization. And also I had this long-term goal of moving back to Italy at a certain point. And so that picked up, and I had different engagements. And then COVID actually happened. And of course, like the world stood still for a few months and not much happened. So I was then already kind of thinking, okay, how, generally a bit kind of exploring, taking the time to learn. Specifically, I was passionate about the topic climate and sustainability. So just taking the time to understand what it could be in that space. And then after a while, actually work picked up again and clients were asking for support in Italy. And so I got busier and busier, and it was really hard because I had days in which I essentially was working 12 to 14 hours because doing the consulting job plus my own things. And we're in lockdown, and I was like with the in-laws in like one room where I was sleeping and working. So something very intense. And there was a bit of like me getting to a point where this is really hard, but I'm like, okay, I'm just stick to it. But then suddenly they made a change of contract, and I wasn't allowed anymore to be in Italy. At the time, I just decided there was no point for me to being in London. Why can't I just be at the seaside with sun and pizza? Much better. So, and then that was kind of giving me, okay, now I'm handing in my notice. I'm starting this out. And I remember that time as a time where nevertheless, the fact that I have built up a network, I've had already clients, I had a financial safety net saved up, I was experiencing such existential anxiety on all my body for a few months that was, wow, I was really, thrown off by it, and it took me quite some time to kind of understand and what is happening and calming down, because this is actually a huge transition. So if you think for most of my career, maybe one of the elements that was everybody was telling me what I should do. And now I was actually kind of charting my own course. The fact that for most of the time, what was made me successful was my ability to adapt and to fit into a culture. And suddenly the opposite was I actually needed to stand out and stand for something and finding my voice and probably the way of how I show up and what I wanted to do. And then there is this sheer possibility of things that you could offer and do as you work for yourself. I think it's never been so easy to work for ourselves. You can set something up. You can offer any type of services. It wasn't even relevant anymore if I was in Italy or not. Everybody was locked in their homes. So I actually started working on projects in London and in Berlin for quite some time. And actually probably the typical freelance thing where you're relatively reactive. So you find a client that actually wants somebody for a certain number of days per week to help them. And so this has been initially my first part, but still keeping workshops and facilitation as one of the elements. And maybe one thing that could be interesting for listeners, one of the elements that I did was specifically around climate and sustainability. It's always, as I was learning, I was transforming things right away into how could I teach this? How could I transfer that knowledge? So almost learning in the open. If you acquire a new skill, just do it and then talk about how you learned it. Because with time, that actually builds up. And so you become an expert, even if you start out not being an expert in something.
Yeah, that's so many things. Again, it's so interesting what you just said there. I mean, they're particularly this kind of, I want to come specifically to the climate thing. Let's just part of it for a second, because I think that's really interesting, your point of view on that. But this point around, even though you had kind of transitioned from 80% or to 20% doing freelancing, even though you've done that and proven that, you still had that sense of anxiety. I mean, I think it's just really important to sort of acknowledge that even you had it when you had practiced and proven it. So it's totally normal to feel like that. I mean, I personally felt like it, I would think for a good 2 years, I felt a sense of anxiety because exactly as you say, I was no longer being told each day, well, not quite each day, but, roughly this is what you're going to do. This is your job. This is how you should do it because there are rules around how you need to operate. But also the sort of structure around me that was disempowering and was too rigid, but also did give me some grounding and some boundaries that were helpful. I didn't expect freedom to be quite so anxiety inducing. And even as you said, there are all these possibilities, but that's quite overwhelming as well, isn't it? What could I do? Well, I could do that. And all of a sudden you're like, actually I've done nothing because I'm just in a world of worrying about what I could do rather than just getting on and doing things. So how did you sort of snap out of that anxiety and start feeling, like you were more in control again and actually this was a good thing that you weren't going to wobble from and then run back to a safety of a job?
I think also for me, one is reminding or taking a long view of time. Like this was a thing that I always wanted to do. So let's try this out and stick to it. I think definitely in those initial moments, what you want is having a support network of other people who might be in a similar situation or in a similar phase, even just to check in and share how you're doing, and to normalize a bit these feelings and knowing, it's not just me. It's like everybody who goes through this kind of initial transition is going through those kind of big shifts. And then I think just taking one step at the time.
So let's get to the climate stuff, because yes, you've been researching a lot of this, learning a lot about this, and then starting to practice some of it. And how do you present yourself now? How do you define the kind of freelancing and services that you offer? Maybe not freelancing. How do you define the services that you offer clients?
I was actually noticed that nobody was talking about the impacts of climate change. It felt like we're doing like, if we are just getting recycling right, and if we are reducing our emissions, we will be fine. And by that time, I actually knew enough that I knew that even if we would stop emissions today, we would actually need to deal with the impacts for over decades. And I found it fascinating that very few were talking about it, and somehow really attracted to this. But I was at the same time very, very afraid of it, because I thought this is actually a lot of suffering and destruction. And so what that means, and I remember even needing quite a few sessions with my therapist to talk that through, because I knew that I wanted to work in this space, but I was terribly afraid of what it would do to me. And then essentially figuring out that probably the only way of coping with that anxiety or those emotions were actually taking actions and going into it. And I remember saying to her, why can't I be a wedding planner and kind of do the best day of like people's lives? And why do I want to actually work on disasters? Yeah. And I realized that definitely it is a taxing topic. And I thought as a designer, I would come in and figure out how people figure out solutions. But then I realized very soon that there was little awareness, that people didn't want to talk about this, that it was something that we tend to deny or procrastinate or ignore. And so actually I realized it's really about how do we deal with the grief of understanding and acknowledging that the world that we have built no longer exists, and that the future is very different to the one that we have imagined. And how can I carve out space and do that in a much more human way and help people process through that, so that they then can take action, and not just from a more technical and policy perspective. And so I was thinking, how can I bring in design? How I can bring in really human and behavioral understanding? And that was very relatively new in that space. So I decided at a certain point that I reached my revenue goal for the year, and I would just take a sabbatical of 3 months to figure out what I wanted to do and what I wanted to offer. And I was thinking, 3 months should be a long time. It actually turned out to be like not at all. And what I did to figure out what it is that I should offer is I started just interviewing people. So I started talking with clients that I had, or potential clients or connections that trusted my work, and asking, what about climate adaptation? What is climate resilience for you? And essentially, maybe what it means is usually all the things that we hear around, like traditional sustainability works on reducing emissions. So it's addressing the root cause. And climate adaptation and resilience is actually dealing with the consequences and the impacts of climate change. So it's much more prevalent in the global south and very little in the global north. And that's an emerging topic. And in climate, only 7% of funding goes into climate adaptation, even it's actually a huge field. And so what I realized is that companies were like, no, we don't see this as an important thing. And then when I spoke to organizations that worked in this topic, they were like, what's design beyond how things look? And so I was like, okay, this is not a very easy spot for me to be in. I'm really like,
it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because there's a gap there that you're potentially connecting these two things up.
Yes. So, but somehow I thought, okay, then I will become very active on LinkedIn and visible around this topic and help people to understand it and raise awareness. But also, I found it fascinating that everybody like both were asking me, what can I do to personally prepare for the future? What can I change in my life? How can I become resilient? What's living a resilient life would look like? And so then that was fascinating. So I started understanding how do people like live, what could they do from the financial perspective, what did it mean from a relational, where they live, their environment, their communities. And I realized that probably the number one element that would make a key difference would be how you make a living, and that working for yourself is actually one of the most resilient choices, because you can and have full control and agency over what you do, how you do it, when you do it, from where you do it. And that is a fascinating contradiction of how we see working for ourselves as one of the most uncertain options, when actually it probably is one of the most resilient choices.
I think it's so I mean, that's where we start with. When we met before, we were talking about it, because I'd never thought of it at all, that idea that this was a sort of choice for resilience, to work for yourself. And that, I mean, I'd always thought about autonomy, but I'd never thought about it in that context, that this is making me more resilient as an individual. And I also think it's really interesting how we're bringing that big kind of existential climate adaptation, climate resilience question straight to ourselves. Okay, what is it meaning for us as individuals? It's part of the problem with climate that, you know, when you can't bring it to yourself, it always seems too far off and it seems for somebody else to sort out. But here, what you're doing is you're making it highly personal. And that is probably our only route to force action, by making it really personal. If we always think it's up to somebody else to fix this stuff, whether it's flood defenses or whether it's jobs in a particular place or whether it's, you know, environmental policy, if we're always going to assume it's somebody else to fix this, probably that won't get done. But if we take that responsibility, okay, this is what I'm going to do, and we multiply that by the other 7 billion, or ones at least who have some degree of control, then you can see that action can, and outcomes and impact can happen.
Absolutely, I agree with you, because what I experienced in these interviews is ways people didn't understand what it would mean for them and why it was relevant for them personally. They wouldn't care about why would it be relevant for their organization. And so that's also when what I saw is like when I talked about my consulting practice on climate resilience, people were like, what's that? And when I then started talking about this idea of actually how I started essentially then putting this into idea and calling it like IMMA Collective, like a collective of impact makers, of people who actually decide to work for themselves, but actually do that in the climate and social impact space. Because what I observed is that so many people are stuck in a job that doesn't give them meaning. And because we can't have so much, sometimes even other security, now we're in the search of meaning. And that actually they don't know. And the options that we are presented is a bit like our education system prepares us to be employees, kind of work for companies. And then you have accelerators and incubators who want you to build the next unicorn. And there is nothing for people who actually want to decide, I want to stay small, I want to be nimble. And then there is also this, another freelancer described it very nicely. It's like the fact of, if you want to have employees, it's like, it's the same decision as having children. Do you want that responsibility? And some of us just want that independence. And it's also because we have our phone, and our phone is essentially like a tool to build a business like tomorrow. Like, it's never been that easy. And it's also never been that easy to just get like extra help and extra support. So you don't maybe need to hire anymore like that people. You get maybe a virtual assistant, and the rest actually you do a lot of things with automation, and you can actually design it or set it up in a way that it works with your life and with what you would like to do. I think it's just that we think that we need to do it alone. And that's similar to being a single tree exposed to all the weathers and the storms. If we would do it together and build our solo businesses together, we would actually be much more a forest that is also connected to the roots and passes nutrients and supports each other's and that's a bit the idea behind IMMA Collective. Is a bit, you could think of it as as a community garden where everybody has their piece of allotment and plot, and they're essentially cultivating their own garden, their own business. And we just do it in a shared spaces where we share advice, feedback, opportunities, connections. One of the things that I see is that actually maybe freelancers is sometimes a step in between of then building something different and bigger. So that you move from this freelancing in a very reactive way of what comes your way into really solopreneurship, or you take a much more entrepreneurial and proactive perspective.
One of the things I'm fascinated by, in fact, arguably it's one of the reasons why I wrote this book, is I'm fascinated by confidence. And I'm interested in how you feel your confidence is related to that point about being empowered. How do you feel your confidence is compared to when you were as a consultant working for somebody else, or even further back?
I think it's drastically different. Like I feel very confident in what I do and how I show up. And I think that might not have been so at the beginning, because I think exactly you need to understand what is your voice, what are your opinions, what do you strongly believe in. And if you take that time to really explore that, and you will see it you show up completely differently. And of course, confidence is not something you achieve. It goes up and down. And then what I hear from many freelancers or people who work for themselves is like, you might then have quieter periods, or you might sometimes maybe have not so much work. Or even when I actually did that step out and then tried to come back in, at the beginning, you're like, can I still do this? You have much more self-doubt. And I think it's, a friend recently said, work begets work. So the more you do it, the more you actually then become and get, again, confident, or get that trust in yourself. And I think that's also why sometimes it is so important to have other people, or to create yourself rituals, because when you're not working anymore in a company, you don't have anybody who gives feedback and gives a pat on the shoulder. Maybe you are asking people for testimonials, maybe your clients are saying something. So practicing and having rituals like writing down your weekly wins, to celebrate what you have achieved. Or if I can't do it weekly, I actually run a monthly session that's called Sense and Respond, and I've been doing that for like a year now. And it's drastically changed how you work, because if you take that moment to reflect, you actually see how far you come. You stop constantly looking at what's ahead of me, what I'm missing, but you actually appreciate all the work that you did in 1 month, and you celebrate yourself, but also you have a grateful, like an exercise of, usually I think about who really impacted and helped me this month. And then just sending thank you notes to those people. I mean, it's just fascinating how if we would carve out that time to, one, reflect, and two, appreciate ourselves and others, how that would just make us feel more empowered, and as a consequence also more confident.
Yes. I mean, I totally agree with that, because I do think we have this sort of all humans tendency just to be looking forward and never looking back. And yes, without anybody around you giving you feedback, like you get in a team typically, it's positive and negative, but you're getting some feedback. Yeah, your confidence can be a bit, well, you can feel just very vulnerable, I think, really. And so part of your strategy, your tactic, really to stop that vulnerability, like, turning into a horrible vortex or something and of decline, is to just stop, reflect, and recognize the build that is going on step by step every month, to the business, to you personally, to the people you're impacting, to those that are impacting you. I think it's a really lovely idea.
It's incredibly important when you have conversations with other people, and to be convincing, and clients to actually say, yes, take my money, help me support you, that they feel that you are confident about it. I think I think this is also not just about what you provide, but actually taking the time to understand what you want to offer. Because when you offer something that you think you should offer, but you haven't spent the time truly understanding if it aligns with your value and what you believe in, then you're not that convincing in selling it. And it will be very hard to potentially even show up on social media and promoting yourself and promoting your services. It will feel like a chore. And when actually you offer something that you are really excited about, people will sense that and they want to spend time with somebody who has that energy.
Brilliant, Lilli. That's a great place to end the podcast. So thanks so much. I hope that's going to really both sort of educate people a bit on options and ways of thinking about freelancing. And I think one of the things I really particularly like is you sort of present a sort of spectrum of freelancing, from doing the kind of reactive stuff that maybe you need to do just to begin with. And maybe you always want to have a little bit of that, keeps energy in there, keeps a bit fun and keeps lots of variety. Building up to kind of like really big relationships that are kind of strategic and where you're having real impact and maybe you're even feeling part of a team doing that. All of these things are possible. It's not the kind of box of freelancer that's doing an hour at a time and then drastically spending time trying to recover cash from lots of different employers. It can be more relationship based than maybe people think.
Definitely. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me and for this conversation.
Really enjoyed it.
Yes.
Thank you.
Truly a lot as well.